For over 4 decades, Elvis fans have been trading bootleg recordings in parking lots, online forums, and collector conventions. These aren't your typical concert recordings. They're studio outtakes, rehearsal sessions, and songs that were supposed to be erased but somehow survived. The holy grail among collectors? The Unreleased 30, a mythical list of songs that Elvis recorded but never officially released. Some claim these tracks were hidden because they were too controversial. Others say Colonel Tom Parker suppressed them for financial reasons. And a few believe the recordings contain evidence of Elvis's declining health in his final years, vocals slurred by medication, lyrics forgotten mid-song, and the estate doesn't want that version of the king to exist in the public consciousness. What makes this story so compelling isn't just the music, it's the conspiracy around it. Because every time someone asks Graceland's archivists about unreleased material, they get the same carefully worded response: "We're always reviewing our collection for potential future releases." Not a denial, not a confirmation, just enough ambiguity to keep the mystery alive. And in 2003, when a supposedly lost song called "I'm a Roustabout" suddenly appeared on an official release, it proved what collectors had been saying all along. The vault isn't empty. The question isn't whether unreleased Elvis recordings exist, it's how many, and why we're not allowed to hear them. Before we dive deeper into this mystery, make sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any updates on this incredible story. The story begins not in 1977 when Elvis died, but decades earlier, in the cramped recording studios of Memphis, Nashville, and later Hollywood. Every time Elvis stepped up to a microphone between 1953 and 1977, magnetic tape was rolling. Studio protocol in those days was simple: record everything, keep everything, archive everything. Engineers would capture not just the final approved version of each song, but every single take leading up to it. Elvis, a notorious perfectionist who could spend 8 hours working on a 3-minute song, generated an enormous amount of material. A typical recording session for one track might produce 10 to 15 different takes, each with subtle variations in vocal delivery, instrumental arrangements, even lyrics. The final master version would be selected, polished, and released. But what happened to all those other takes? According to standard industry practice, they went into the vault, temperature-controlled storage facilities, where record labels archived their assets. For RCA Records, which signed Elvis in 1955 and controlled his recording output for over 2 decades, this meant thousands upon thousands of reels of tape containing alternate versions, false starts, studio banter, rehearsal sessions, and songs that were recorded but never completed. Some of these recordings were eventually released as bonus tracks or collector's editions decades later, but many simply vanished into the archive, never to be heard again. The first hints that something unusual was happening emerged in the early 1980s, just a few years after his death. Bootleg traders started circulating cassette tapes of Elvis material that wasn't available through any legitimate channel. These weren't concert recordings, they were studio-quality tracks, complete with professional mixing and instrumental backing, songs with titles that didn't appear in any official RCA catalog, performances that sounded fully finished, not rough demos or incomplete sketches. The bootleg community exploded with speculation. Where were these recordings coming from? Some claimed they were stolen from RCA's vaults by disgruntled employees. Others believed they were duplicates that Elvis himself had given to friends and family, which later found their way into collectors' hands. What nobody could explain was why, if these recordings existed and sounded this good, RCA hadn't released them officially. After all, Elvis albums continued to sell millions of copies even after his death. Any new material would have been a guaranteed commercial success, so why keep it hidden? To understand the mystery of Elvis's unreleased recordings, you have to understand Colonel Tom Parker, the man who controlled every aspect of Elvis's career from 1955 until the day the king died. Parker wasn't actually a colonel, the title was honorary. His real name wasn't even Tom Parker. He was born Andreas Cornelis van Kwijk in the Netherlands, and he had entered the United States illegally in the 1920s, a secret he guarded obsessively for his entire life. This meant Parker could never leave the country, which is why Elvis never performed outside North America, despite receiving offers from promoters worldwide. But it also meant Parker lived in constant fear of exposure, which made him paranoid, controlling, and willing to make decisions that prioritized his own security over Elvis's artistic interests. Parker's contract with Elvis was extraordinarily one-sided. By the 1970s, Parker was taking 50% of Elvis's earnings, far more than the industry standard of 15 to 20% for management. He controlled which songs Elvis recorded, which movies he appeared in, which concerts he performed. And most importantly for our story, Parker had significant influence over what happened to Elvis's recordings after they were made. Multiple sources who worked with Elvis during his final years have described sessions where Parker would arrive at the studio, listen to what had been recorded, and make immediate decisions about what would and wouldn't be released. Sometimes these decisions made commercial sense, but other times, according to studio engineers who were present, Parker would veto material that seemed perfectly releasable, songs that were too personal, too revealing about Elvis's deteriorating condition, too different from the commercial formula that had made Elvis a star. One recording engineer, speaking anonymously to a collector's magazine in the 1990s, described a session in 1976 where Elvis recorded a haunting, stripped-down version of a gospel song. The performance was intensely emotional. Elvis was crying by the end, his voice cracking with genuine grief over his mother's death nearly 2 decades earlier. When Parker heard the playback, his response was immediate: "This will never be released." The engineer asked why. Parker's explanation was chilling. "Nobody wants to hear Elvis cry. They want to hear the king." The tape was filed away, given a catalog number, and disappeared into the vault. Whether it still exists today, and whether it's one of the fabled unreleased 30, nobody knows for certain. For years, the existence of significant unreleased Elvis material remained purely speculative. Bootleg collectors claimed to have evidence. Studio veterans told stories. But without official confirmation from either Graceland or RCA, the whole thing could have been dismissed as wishful thinking by obsessive fans. Then, in 2003, something extraordinary happened. BMG, the company that had acquired RCA Records, announced they were releasing a new Elvis compilation called Second to None. The album would feature Elvis's biggest hits alongside previously unreleased material from the vaults. When the track list was revealed, collectors around the world lost their minds. Because there, listed as track 14, was a song called I'm a Roustabout, a track that had been recorded in 1964 for the movie of the same name but had supposedly been lost for nearly 40 years. The bootleg community had been talking about this song for decades. A few claimed to have heard degraded cassette copies, but most believed it was gone forever, the master tape destroyed or misplaced during one of RCA's many corporate reorganizations. Yet here it was, restored from the original masters, sounding crisp and professional. The significance wasn't just that one lost song had been found. It was what the discovery implied. If I'm a Roustabout had been sitting in the vault all along, mislabeled or forgotten, what else was in there? The release sparked a renewed investigation by Elvis historians and archivists. Research teams began combing through studio logs, session documentation, and interviews with surviving engineers and musicians who had worked with Elvis. What they found was stunning. Between 1954 and 1977, Elvis had recorded far more material than had ever been officially released. Studio logs from Elvis's Nashville sessions in the 1960s, for example, show song titles that never appeared on any album. Some were cover versions of contemporary hits that Elvis recorded just for fun during breaks. Others were original compositions that were abandoned mid-session when Elvis or the producers decided they weren't working. Still others were complete, finished recordings that were simply never selected for release, perhaps because an album was already full or because the song didn't fit the current marketing strategy. One particularly tantalizing example appeared in logs from a 1970 session, a song listed only as Untitled Blues, recorded in the early morning hours after a regular session had ended. 3 takes were documented. The tape's location was listed as Vault B7, but when researchers tried to locate the actual recording decades later, it had vanished. Did it still exist somewhere in the climate-controlled maze of RCA's archive storage? Had it been destroyed? Or had it been removed for reasons nobody was willing to discuss? While official channels remained frustratingly vague about what existed in the vaults, the bootleg community had been building its own archive for decades. Starting in the 1970s and exploding with the advent of the Internet in the 1990s, collectors created elaborate networks for trading rare Elvis material. The most prized items were studio recordings, the holy grail material that supposedly came directly from the RCA vaults. The quality of these bootlegs varied wildly. Some were clearly multiple-generation copies, degraded from being dubbed from tape to tape over the years, with hiss and distortion making them barely listenable. But others were startlingly clear, suggesting they had been copied directly from master tapes or high-quality safety copies. How did material get out of supposedly secure archive facilities? In 1988, a former RCA employee was arrested for attempting to sell master tapes of various artists, including Elvis, to collectors. The tapes had been smuggled out over a period of several years, hidden in everyday items like lunchboxes and briefcases. The employee claimed he was preserving musical history that the record label was neglecting, but prosecutors saw it as simple theft. The case raised uncomfortable questions. How much other material had walked out of the archive over the decades? By the early 2000s, Internet forums dedicated to Elvis bootlegs had compiled comprehensive lists of known unreleased material. These lists, based on decades of trading and comparing notes, claimed to document over 100 unreleased studio recordings, including the famous Unreleased 30, tracks that multiple sources agreed existed, sounded commercially viable, and had been deliberately withheld from official release. The list included songs recorded during every phase of Elvis's career. From his Sun Records days in the mid-1950s, there were supposedly several unreleased blues numbers and country covers. From the RCA Nashville sessions of the 1960s, the list included gospel songs recorded for personal reasons rather than commercial albums. From the 1970s Vegas and touring years, the most controversial items on the list were recordings that allegedly captured Elvis's declining vocal abilities and increasing reliance on prescription medication. These were the tracks that, according to bootleg lore, the Presley estate absolutely did not want released because they damaged Elvis's carefully maintained image as an untouchable icon. One track in particular became legendary among collectors, a version of Unchained Melody supposedly recorded in the studio in 1977, just months before Elvis's death. Several concert versions of this song exist, including a haunting performance from June 1977, where Elvis can barely get through the vocals. But the studio version, if it exists, has never been officially released. Bootleg traders claim to have heard it, a stripped-down piano arrangement with Elvis's voice cracking with emotion and physical exhaustion. Over the years, several people who worked directly with Elvis have come forward with specific memories of unreleased material. Their accounts, while impossible to fully verify, provide the most credible evidence that significant recordings remain hidden. Jerry Scheff, the bass player who worked with Elvis during the 1970s, described in a 2018 interview a late-night recording session in Las Vegas, where Elvis, struggling with insomnia and heavy medication, insisted on recording gospel songs until dawn. Scheff remembered at least 4 complete songs being recorded, all deeply personal hymns that Elvis sang with raw emotion. When Scheff asked if these would be released, Elvis told him, "These are just for me and God." Scheff never heard those recordings again and has no idea if they still exist. Felton Jarvis, Elvis's producer during the final years, mentioned in a radio interview before his own death in 1981 that there were songs I wish the world could hear but Colonel won't allow it. Jarvis wouldn't elaborate on what those songs were or why Parker had blocked them, saying only that Elvis was more honest in those recordings than he ever was in public. Red West, one of Elvis's closest friends and bodyguards, described in his controversial 1977 book, Elvis, What Happened, finding Elvis alone in a home studio, recording songs on a basic tape machine. West claimed Elvis was documenting his thoughts and feelings about his life, his regrets, his addictions. Elvis told West that these recordings were the real story and that someday people will understand. Most intriguingly, Marty Lacker, another member of Elvis's inner circle, claimed in a 2007 interview that he personally saw Colonel Parker remove master tapes from RCA's storage facility in the early 1980s. According to Lacker, Parker was systematically going through the archive after Elvis's death, pulling anything he deemed unsuitable for release. What happened to those tapes? Lacker believed Parker destroyed some and kept others as insurance against the Presley estate. After Parker's death in 1997, his personal belongings were sold at auction, but no Elvis master tapes were ever discovered among them. If they existed, they either went to an anonymous buyer or were destroyed before the estate sale. These testimonies highlight the fundamental problem with the unreleased recordings mystery. Without access to the actual archive, everything is speculation based on memory and second-hand information. The only people who truly know what exists are the archivists at Graceland and RCA Legacy, and they're not talking. Understanding the unreleased recordings mystery requires following the money, because financial incentives have shaped every decision about Elvis's archive since his death in 1977. When Elvis died, his estate was in shambles. Despite earning hundreds of millions of dollars during his career, decades of Colonel Parker's mismanagement and Elvis's extravagant spending had left the estate with only about $5 million in assets and significant debts. Priscilla Presley, who took control of the estate, made the brilliant decision to turn Graceland into a tourist attraction and to aggressively pursue licensing opportunities. By the 1990s, Elvis Presley Enterprises was generating over $100 million annually. Today, Elvis remains one of the highest-earning deceased celebrities. The unreleased recordings are valuable assets in this financial ecosystem. Every time RCA Legacy releases a new compilation featuring previously unreleased tracks, it generates millions in sales, streaming revenue, and renewed interest in Elvis's catalog. The standard industry practice is to save these releases for strategic moments, major anniversaries, slow sales periods, or when a marketing push is needed. This is why the complete Elvis Presley Masters box set in 2010, despite its comprehensive title, wasn't actually complete. Releasing everything at once would have exhausted their archive of rarities in a single project. By holding material back, they ensure a steady stream of new Elvis releases for decades to come. The streaming era has intensified this strategy. Platforms like Spotify and Apple Music pay based on listener streams, which means catalog artists benefit enormously from keeping their material in circulation and constantly refreshing it with new content. An album of previously unreleased Elvis recordings can generate hundreds of millions of streams, each one producing revenue for the estate. This creates a perverse incentive. The more unreleased material that exists, the more valuable the archive becomes. The financial stakes also explain why bootleggers remain active despite legal threats and occasional prosecutions. A high-quality recording of unreleased Elvis material can sell for thousands of dollars among serious collectors. The bootleg market creates its own economy parallel to the official one, and as long as Graceland restricts access to archival material, that parallel economy will continue to exist. After decades of speculation, bootleg trading, occasional official releases, and carefully worded non-denials from Graceland, we're left with a frustrating truth. We'll probably never know the full extent of what exists in Elvis's archive. The people who have access to the complete catalog are bound by confidentiality agreements and corporate policy not to discuss it publicly. The people who worked with Elvis and have first-hand knowledge of recording sessions are mostly deceased or in their 80s and 90s, their memories fading. The bootleg community can only document what's leaked out, which is by definition a subset of what exists. What we can say with confidence is this: yes, unreleased Elvis recordings exist. The number is probably in the dozens, possibly in the hundreds if you count every alternate take and incomplete fragment. Some of this material is probably commercially viable and could be released without controversy. Some of it is likely too poor in quality or too incomplete to be worth releasing. And some of it probably does reveal aspects of Elvis's life and declining health that the estate would prefer remain private. The 30-plus unreleased songs that collectors talk about is likely a reasonable estimate of fully finished, commercially viable tracks that exist but haven't been officially released. This brings us to the deeper question that underlies the entire unreleased recordings controversy. Who owns Elvis's legacy? Is it the Presley Estate, which has legal ownership of his recordings and image? Is it the fans, who've kept his memory alive and continue to generate revenue through their devotion? Is it music historians, who argue that Elvis is too culturally important to be controlled by private commercial interests? Or is it Elvis himself, whose wishes about privacy and image should be respected even after death? There's no easy answer, which is why the debate over unreleased recordings has become so heated. Different stakeholders have fundamentally different interests. The estate wants to preserve Elvis's iconic image and maximize long-term revenue. Fans want to know their hero as authentically as possible. Historians want access to complete documentation for scholarly purposes. The compromise that's emerged over the past few decades: slow, controlled release of archival material through official channels, with the most sensitive or low-quality material remaining permanently in the vault, probably represents the best balance of these competing interests. But it's a compromise that leaves nobody fully satisfied. For fans who've spent decades collecting bootlegs and trading rare recordings, the official releases are too slow and too selective. For the estate, bootleggers represent theft of valuable intellectual property. For historians, the lack of transparency about what exists in the archive is maddening. What we do know is that the mystery of Elvis's unreleased recordings has become part of his legend. In a strange way, the fact that we can't hear everything makes what we can hear more precious. The possibility that somewhere in a climate-controlled vault in Memphis there are recordings that would change our understanding of Elvis Presley keeps the dream alive. Maybe that's exactly what the estate wants. Or maybe it's just the way things worked out. Either way, the tapes, whatever they contain, remain locked away, their secrets preserved, the mystery enduring. And as long as Elvis fans exist, they'll keep speculating, keep trading bootlegs, keep hoping that someday, somehow, they'll finally hear the complete story of the king.